Hello everyone, my name is Elena Shevchuk and this is Lookup channel. Today I will tell you about the large-scale counteroffensive in the spring in Ukraine, which will be launched by the armed forces of Ukraine. Turning point for Ukraine and its Western allies is coming. Ukraine is getting ready to launch a large-scale counteroffensive within the next few months. Kyiv's ability to liberate the occupied territories by Russia will largely depend on the pace and extent of the Western weapons supplies, as well as the pace of the Ukrainian recruits' military training that thousands of them are undergoing in Europe and the United States right now. As of now, Russia is holding under occupation the Ukrainian territories in Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia regions, as well as Crimea. It is almost 18% of Ukrainian territory. To liberate them, Ukraine aspires to receive as large numbers of offensive weapons and tanks as possible. Looking back in December, the head of the armed forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, stated that the Ukrainian military needed several hundred tanks to liberate Ukraine up to the borders by February 2022. By now, the number of battle tanks discussed is about 700. So far, the coalition has pledged just 2 battalions of the most modern Leopards. A Ukrainian tank battalion is supposed to have 31 tanks. Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands are also purchasing at least 100 older but refurbished Leopards for Ukraine, making up another 3 battalions. The first Leopards have already arrived in Ukraine.
Jakie pierwsze wrażenia?
Przepraszam, a gdzie jest droga na Moscow?
The Leopards are being supplemented with a motley collection of other tanks. Britain is sending a company of 14 Challenger 2. America has promised 31 Abrams tanks, though they may not arrive this year. Poland has already sent around 250 Soviet T-72 tanks to Ukraine and will send 60 modernized T-72s, a variety of infantry fighting vehicles from the aging Soviet-era BMP-1 to America's Stryker and Bradley vehicles will pad out the armored brigades. But this is just a piece of the puzzle. There was a more important shift in strategy, says The Economist this week. In December, America and Britain realized that a protracted war was not in the West's interests. The turning point came on January 20th at the 8th meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at Ramstein in Germany. There, allies agreed to equip Ukraine with more than a division's worth of kit, which aim of having much of it in place by the end of March. In recent months, the flow of arms has turned from a trickle to a flood. Of all the military aid pledged by the Pentagon since the war began, 40% or over $8 billion has come in the 3 months since December. The infusion of arms agreed in Germany in January alone amounts to 2/3 of the total sent to Ukraine in all of 2020-22. General Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's top officer, hopes that he will eventually have 3 new army corps at his disposal, each with 6 brigades and each comprising more than 20,000 men. He sent his troops abroad to train on the new equipment. Since January, America's 7th Army Training Command has been running a 5-week course for Ukrainian units at its Gain-Woher training area in eastern Bavaria. A battalion's worth of soldiers will pass through Gain-Woher each month. Last week, on March 2nd, Mark Milley, America's top general, visited tabletop war games held by America at a base in Wiesbaden, Germany, to help Ukrainian officers consider different options for an offensive. The same modeling allies held last summer on the eve of the fall counteroffensive in Kharkiv and Kherson. Let's see what the challenge is now. The first step would be to pin down Russia's forces in the Kherson and Luhansk regions and in the northern part of Donetsk. Next, Ukraine would free the remainder of Zaporizhia region and push through southern Donetsk to reach the Sea of Azov, severing Russia's land bridge to Ukraine. Ukrainian forces would also need to destroy the Kerch Strait bridge, which connects Russia to the Crimean Peninsula and allows Moscow to resupply its troops by road and rail. That would allow it to deoccupy Crimea. The liberation of the occupied territory of Donbas would be a difficult task for the Ukrainian defenders. Donbas shares a border with Russia and therefore had a direct and quick supply of Russian troops, both with weapons and conscript. Now that's the part of the front line where the most fierce fighting has been taking place since last spring. The fight for Bakhmut, a town in Donetsk province that has been under Russian assault since last summer and the most fierce part of the front line here, has been ongoing for 9 months with no success. In recent days, Russian soldiers and mercenaries have advanced deeper into Bakhmut. But the battle for the town has resulted in far greater Russian losses than Ukrainian ones. As of today, engaged in protracted urban battles around Bakhmut, the Russian military is losing 5 times more troops than the armed forces of Ukraine, claims NATO sources, based on intelligence reports. At the end of the day, Russian assault on Bakhmut didn't contribute to reaching either its operational or strategic military goals. And above all, Russia faced the fact that it has not enough reserves to maintain offensive attempts in several directions. The Ukrainian army chief, General Zaluzhny, in contrast, instead of throwing sizable reserves into Bakhmut to save the city, which is of far greater symbolic than military value, he has sent troops abroad to train on the new equipment. And this week, Ukraine's top army commanders claim they will support the defense of Bakhmut, probably to continue exhausting enemy and preparing the grounds for counteroffensive. Now, let's have a look at Ukrainian South and Kherson region. In November, a successful counter-offensive here enabled the armed forces of Ukraine to liberate a large part of the region. This was the piece of the territory Putin claimed annexed, just a few days before the Ukrainian fall counter-offensive started. Nevertheless, a big part of that region, which is on the opposite side of the Dnieper River, is still under Russian control. Its liberation in the coming months has 2 meanings for Ukraine: tactical and strategic. First, Ukraine is to take back under its control the occupied territories on the opposite bank of the Dnieper River. Thousands of Ukrainians have been captured by Russia over there for a year now. Secondly, liberation of that part of the Kherson region will pave the way to liberation of Crimea. Let's look at it now. Crimea Peninsula. It is commonly thought to be the most complicated step in the liberation of Ukrainian territories. Russia has occupied Crimea since the beginning of its war against Ukraine in February 2014. The Kremlin claimed it has annexed the Ukrainian territory, but only a handful of rock and pariah states have never recognized this claim. And Ukraine's aim is to liberate the whole of its territory, including Crimea, and restore control over the whole of its internationally recognized territory as of its declaration of independence in 1991. Until recently, the widespread notion in the West was that if Ukrainian troops reach Crimea, that could trigger Russian President Putin to use a nuclear weapon. But as the war has progressed and Ukraine has liberated large swaths of its territory from occupying Russian forces, rhetoric regarding Crimea was shifted. And that red line is melting inch by inch. Last week, once very cautious and restrained NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg once again confirmed that allies will support Ukraine in its efforts to restore its internationally recognized borders and regain control of Crimea, including by force. By the summer, Ukraine is likely to begin targeting more of Russia's military infrastructure in Crimea in preparation for a border campaign to liberate the peninsula. Risking a longer and more dangerous war that could embroil NATO, Washington should probably give Ukraine the weapons and assistance it needs to win quickly and decisively in all occupied territories north of Crimea, and to credibly threaten to take the peninsula militarily. Last year, after the explosion on the Crimea bridge, it was damaged enough to complicate for Russians the supply of weapons, ammunition and conscripts to the occupied south of Ukraine. But since then, they underwent some repairs and may be fully restored by the summer. As soon as the bridge is under fire control by Ukrainian forces, it will enable them to launch an operation to deplete Russian forces on the peninsula. Without a land bridge or road or rail links to Crimea, the Kremlin would be forced to revert to maritime resupply, but ferries and barges would not meet its logistical needs for fighting in Crimea and southern Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces would carry out weeks of strikes on Russian forces and infrastructure to degrade the enemy's military capability. Targets would include logistics hubs, air bases, command and control centers, naval installations, and transportation nodes. Keeping Crimea under complete blockade for as long as possible means either to force the occupying enemy to sail away from the peninsula or leave the Russian forces so exhausted that they will not be able to resist when a full-fledged counteroffensive operation begins on the peninsula. One more target to deal would be Russia's Black Sea Fleet, that is based in occupied Crimea itself and Russian Novorossiysk, and pose a threat attacking Ukrainian cities with missiles. To eliminate this threat, Ukrainian armed forces could add a maritime component by using seaborne drones. Or, if Ukraine receives missiles with 300-500 kilometers range, they will be able to fight the remnants of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, striking the base in Novorossiysk, and will remove the problem of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea from the agenda at all. Now, weapons. Even with the fleet of a Western support, Ukraine would struggle to undertake such a large-scale counteroffensive operation. The German Leopard 2 tanks, British Challenger 2 tanks, and American M1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles would certainly improve the odds. But the Ukrainian military would need hundreds of these vehicles as well as an air attack capability, thousands of HIMARS rounds and long-range missiles, and tens of thousands of artillery shells. It would also need greater manned air power and engineering, amphibious and logistics capacity to penetrate fortified Russian defensive lines, clear hundreds of miles of occupied territory, and conduct amphibious and ground assaults to cross into Crimea and dislodge Russian forces. But with an appropriate amount of weapons and an uninterrupted supply of ammunition, Ukraine has a clear perspective to win the initiative and the war. The optimistic scenario can be that a breakthrough in one of the named counteroffensives would cause a fatal collapse of all Russian defenses, leading to panic and escape by the Russian military, quite as it happened when the Russians escaped from the Kharkiv region in the fall of 2022. The less optimistic, though more probable forecast is that counteroffensive will take several months, with the counteroffensive actions in March and the occupation perspective as far as the end of year or the beginning of the next. There are doubts as for the perspective of Ukraine to restore all its pre-war boundaries at a single stroke. But if during the spring or summer counteroffensive, Ukraine can retake control over another significant part of its territory, as it did last year in the north around Kharkiv and in the south around Kherson, it would convince the skeptics that the war is not doomed to stalemate. Anyway, if Ukraine is able to liberate all its territories by the end of the year or in the beginning of 2024, that would mean the end of the 10-year war already. For exactly 9 years ago from now, in February and March 2014, Ukraine was attacked by Russian troops for the first time. And exactly this week marks the 3,300 days or 9 years of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Also, if you speak German or have German-speaking friends, I recommend you to check out the vlogs of Fabian Seger, who made a great episode about Ukrainians and Ukrainian during the war.